Chapter 3, Follow Your Dreams, Friday, June 21st, 1867. At the back of the schoolyard of the Elmstead Pew Settlement School, Sophie and Will sat on the top of the hill like they did almost every recess for the last 8 years, talking and talking. "Can you believe it, Sophie? It's been 8 years since we walked through the doors of our little log schoolhouse." "It sure went by fast, didn't it, Will? Remember that first day after school when you fell into the Puce River?" "I sure do," Will said. "The next day when we came back to school, all the other kids surrounded young Jim, Matthew, and me, treating us like heroes." "I also seem to remember the look of admiration in your eyes when you looked at me," he said, laughing. "I was looking at you because I thought it was silly of you to go walking on top of that slippery old log in the first place," Sophie responded, crossing her arms, trying to look contrite. The two of them continued laughing and talking about how they became good friends from that day on. "So, today we graduate out of grade 8. Are you still going to be a doctor, Sophie?" "Yes, I told Father I would like to go to France, where we still have a lot of family. My grandfather is a country doctor like my dad, and he travels to different villages visiting his patients. I want to continue school in France, help my grandfather, and become a doctor." Will looked at his friend with respect. "I'm very happy for you. Mrs. Kerr and I always thought you'd be a great doctor one day." "What are you going to do?" Sophie asked. "Well, I'm thinking about trying to get a job with the railroad. I hear they are hiring a lot of people now, and if I get a job, I will travel and be paid at the same time. I told Mama, but I haven't told my dad yet. I know he wants me to stay on the farm," Will said. Sophie held both of Will's hands and looked earnestly into his eyes. "William Perry, follow your dreams. I know your parents, and what they want more than anything is for you to be happy, so I'm sure your father will support your decision." "I hope you're right," Will said. This time she sensed a little more confidence in Will's voice. Just then the bell began ringing, so Will stood up and reached down to assist Sophie. "The last school bell for us," Will said as they headed back. Once they reached the school, Will stopped and gently grabbed Sophie's arm, turning her toward him. He looked into her teary eyes. They hugged. She smiled up at Will, stuck out her tongue, and walked through the schoolhouse door. That evening at the supper table, Will showed his graduation certificate. Everyone was there except his older brother Joseph, who had moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan last year. There was his mother, father, his sister Margaret, and her husband Fred Anderson with their 2 little children, brother young Jim and his new wife Annie Sue, along with his sisters, 6-year-old Parthena and 4-year-old Sarah, who were clapping and cheering their brother. Will's father started to speak, so his sisters, Parthena and Sarah, began to quiet down. "Will, have you thought about what you're going to do now that you have graduated?" Will's father asked, smiling proudly. "You know my brother, your Uncle Jim, and Aunt Lynetta weren't blessed to have children, and so they will be leaving their farm to you and young Jim. He and Annie Sue are almost finished building their home and will be moving out soon, so you 2 boys need to talk about how you can continue the family farms. You remember the Reverend preaching at our church last Sunday about how blessed we are in our little community and that we must all seek honest work?" Kazar looked at her son and nodded slightly. Will was glad he touched the horseshoe above the door before he came in the house. He took a deep breath and began speaking. "Daddy, I have been thinking. You know how I've always wanted to travel, so I thought about getting a job on the railroad, and that way I could get paid to travel. Then perhaps after a while I'll come back and help young Jim on the farm." Will seemed out of breath by the time he had finished talking. Everyone at the table sat looking intently at Henry. After what seemed an eternity, his father cleared his throat. "Well, son, you're practically a man, so I guess I must respect your decision. Uncle Jim, a doo-doo White Cloud, young Jim, and I will keep the farms going while you get this traveling the world business out of your system. My only advice is to be honest and nice to everyone you meet." "Hooray!" shouted Parthena and Sarah. "Now let's bless this food," Henry Perry said, "so I can ask my graduated son what he learned in school." 1861 to 1865, the Civil War in the United States was waged between the southern states and northern states. This becomes the first major conflict in which railroads played a major role, as both sides used trains to move troops and supplies. At the end of this war, the golden age of railroads begins. Travel by train became the major mode of transportation. The railroad network grew from 35,000 miles of track to a peak of 254,000 miles by 1916. In 1867, when 14-year-old Will Perry left all his friends and family in the Elmstead Pew settlement, he had no idea he was about to become part of this golden age. It was a beautiful summer day. A lone figure could be seen walking along the dusty country road, a bundle of clothing tied to the stick he had over his shoulder. He seemed alone, and one wondered, was he lonely? Looking into the serene face of this person, however, you knew for certain he was at peace. Will smiled to himself, believing he was the luckiest person in the world. He looked overhead at a flock of Canadian geese flying by. "Are you guys following your dreams?" Will shouted. The geese honked in reply, continuing their journey. I am too, Will thought. He also thought that having dreams was great, but to fulfill them you must have a plan. The day after his father gave his blessing and encouragement to get a railroad job, Will knew he should talk to the older members in the community for advice and information. While he walked, he remembered back to the evening Uncle Jim, Dr. Clare, and John Freeman Walls came over to their home to play their weekly game of cards. Will knew his uncle, Mr. Walls, and his father came to the Elmstead Pew settlement from the United States on what was known as the Underground Railroad, so he figured they obviously knew something about railroads. Once the men finished their card game, Will began asking them a million questions about that railroad. How did they dig a tunnel for a railroad thousands of miles underground? Why did so many people leave the United States when there seemed to be so many jobs and opportunities? Why did the Americans go to war and fight each other, sometimes brother against brother and father against son? Did any of them ever work on this railroad that went underground? So many questions, they all said, laughing. I tell you what, Will's father said, we'll each pick a question and answer it the best we can. John Freeman, you were one of the first to come to this community on the Underground Railroad. Wasn't it in 1846 when you and your wife, Miss Jane King, came here? Why don't you start by telling Will about those tunnels we had to dig so we could ride the trains underground? The four men began laughing again as Will looked at them wondering what was so funny and if he had missed a joke. John Freeman Walls was a tall, dark man of pure African descent, and he had very sharp features with smooth skin. John had been a carpenter on the Walls plantation back in North Carolina, and those skills not only helped him build his two-story log cabin on the Puce Road, but the homes of many others, including Dr. Clare's and Joe and Jim Perry's. Like the Perrys, he was well respected in the community, not only for his reputation as being a hard worker, but for being honest as well. John was personally interested in Will going to the United States because when he came back to visit, he could tell him how much the America he had left in 1846 was different in the 1860s. He knew railroad travel was a growing industry, but when he came to Canada with his family, he traveled on a much different kind of railroad. Will, I think it is very brave and smart of you to decide to take this opportunity to travel and meet other people while you are young. When I was your age, I never had that opportunity because I was trapped in a terrible institution known as slavery. My chance to escape this situation came when I, along with my family, boarded that famous Underground Railroad freedom movement. I know you wondered why we laughed when you asked about the railroad we came to Canada on. We weren't being rude. It's just that a lot of people think the Underground Railroad was a train that ran underground. The fact is, the Underground Railroad wasn't a train at all, but a freedom movement. It was the first great freedom movement in the Americas where good people of different races and faiths worked together in harmony, assisting those escaping enslavement in the southern United States to freedom in the northern United States and Canada. They called it the Underground Railroad because it was done in secret, and they would use railroad words to confuse the bounty hunters and slave catchers. For example, your uncle, father, and I would be known as passengers. The people that would guide us along the way would be conductors. The brave people that would hide us in the basements of their homes, churches, or haylofts of barns were the station keepers, and these hiding places would be the stations. Communities like ours here in Canada, where the former enslaved people settled, would be the terminals, which was the end of the Underground Railroad, and this was where we were free. John Freeman continued. One of the first organizers of this freedom movement was Levi Coffin, a Quaker abolitionist who was from North Carolina just like me. He moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and directed a lot of the activities from there. He was known as the first president of the Underground Railroad. This had to be done in secret because it was illegal for anyone to help these freedom seekers. The people who were enslaved were the property of those that owned them, and to steal or help in their escape was no different than if you stole someone's horse or cattle, and this was punishable by law. The most famous conductor was an escaped slave by the name of Harriet Tubman, who helped many make it to freedom, including some who live in our community. When we left North Carolina with our family, we were lucky, because Jane's father is Irish and her mother is Scottish, and so she was able to pretend to be my owner. This helped to get us out of many dangerous situations. So you see, Will, the Underground Railroad freedom movement is much different than the railroad you are going to go and work for. Will sat there with his mouth open, amazed by what he had just learned. Close your mouth, son, before a bug flies in it. Listen up, there is more to tell you. Your Uncle Jim will answer your next question. Jim Perry was tall like his brother and the rest of the Perry family. Will had learned his father's ancestors descended from a tribe of tall Africans. They weren't sure which tribe, but his Uncle Jim had told him they were from somewhere in West Africa. Jim had long black hair that he tied back with a string and a beard that hung to his chest. Everyone liked him because he was always laughing and had a lot of funny stories to tell. The children in the community would gather around him at picnics or church events. He would keep them entranced with stories he would make up, like cats that could fly, dogs that could run like the wind, animals that could become invisible, and spiders that could talk. The story he was about to tell Will, however, was true. Uncle Jim turned to Will and looked him straight in the eye. Your question for me is, why did we leave the United States and come to Canada? There are many different reasons and circumstances that caused each of us to make that decision. The jobs and opportunities available weren't as plentiful as you may think. When we came to Canada before the American Civil War, it was still legal to enslave people of African descent in the United States. And believe me, we were not paid for our labor. Many that gave of this free labor without complaining were not always appreciated for what they did. Do you know Mr. Jones that lives at the end of Old Mill Road? Yes, Will said. He knew all the children thought he was a crazy man, always talking to himself and living alone in his log cabin way back in the woods. I know a lot of you children think he is strange, Uncle Jim said. Yes, Will had to admit. Then let me tell you why he is that way. Before he came here, Mr. Jones lived on a plantation in South Carolina. He had a wife and 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. They were some of the few people enslaved that had a pretty good life. Mr. Jones was the head overseer on the plantation, and he organized the other slaves working in the fields. His wife Emma was the head cook, who prepared the meals for the owner and his wife. One day, the owner passed away suddenly with a heart attack. The owner's wife was so sad that within 2 weeks she followed her husband in death, caused by what many say was a broken heart. Since they never had any children, the owner's brother, who lived on a neighboring plantation, inherited his land and property. The first thing he started doing was selling off a lot of the slaves on his brother's farm. Emma and her children were the first to be sold because their new owner already had a cook at his house. A slave trader was passing through the area, purchasing unwanted slaves from different plantations and taking them further south to the sugar plantations in Louisiana to sell for a profit. Despite Mr. Jones protesting, his wife and children were sold anyway and gone within a week of the previous owner's death. Needless to say, Mr. Jones was devastated and was never the same. From that day on, he began planning his escape so he could search for his family. 2 years passed, and finally the opportunity presented itself, and he ran. For 5 years he traveled all over the slave states trying to find Emma and his children. He survived in the wilderness, hiding by day, and at nightfall sneaking around slave cabins on different plantations looking for his family, but never finding them. How he eventually arrived in the Elmstead Pew settlement no one ever knew. He told me this story one time, but has never talked about it since, Uncle Jim said. Will sat there embarrassed. He never made fun of Mr. Jones like a lot of the other children, but he never defended him either when they did. One thing he learned from Uncle Jim's story is you can never judge a book by its cover. This means if you really want to get to know people and to better understand what they have been through, the best way is by talking to them. Uncle Jim continued, "This is why many of us who got the chance to make a better life for ourselves and our family took that chance and came to Canada." To answer Will's next question, Dr. Clare spoke up. "You know, my family is of French descent. My father still lives in France, practicing medicine and caring for his patients. My daughter says she already told you that she intends to follow in our footsteps and become a doctor. You wondered why the people of the United States had a war among themselves, known as a Civil War. You learned in school that this war started in 1861 and ended just a couple of years ago in 1865, with many people losing their homes, family, and lives. There were several reasons for the cause of this war, and one of those reasons was to end the enslavement of the colored man. This was a noble and necessary endeavor because slavery is a disease that infects and harms not only the person that is enslaved, but the person that keeps them enslaved. Before the war, many people felt if they gave up their property or their slaves, it would affect their livelihood because they became dependent on this free labor. Of course, money was the main motivating factor encouraging people to hold on to their slaves. They failed to realize that people will work harder when they are happy and being paid for their labor. This caused divisions within families between those that were for slavery and those against, resulting in brother fighting against brother and fathers against sons. On January 1st, 1863, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, passed what was known as the Emancipation Proclamation. This law technically ended slavery, but only in the rebellious states, leaving the nation half slave and half free. Those in these southern states, whose agricultural economy depended on the labor of the enslaved, opposed this new law. One of the reasons President Lincoln enacted this law was because of pressure from the international community and the fact the Civil War was negatively affecting trade with England and my homeland, France. The citizens of these countries at this time were now opposed to slavery, especially after reading the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, that exposed some of the horrors the slaves were experiencing. Lincoln knew that by passing a law that emancipated the enslaved, the citizens of France and England would not support their government's involvement in the war after that. With those countries staying out of the war, it allowed the northern states, which were stronger industrially and with a larger population, to have a better chance of winning, which they eventually did. The law also planted a seed of hope among many of the enslaved that victory for the North could mean their ticket to freedom, so a lot of them left the plantations to join the Northern Army. The more Will heard, the more he understood why these men were the way they were. It was time for his father to answer the final question. "You wondered if any of us worked on the Underground Railroad? I'm sure you now understand that the Underground Railroad did not involve the trains you see going down the tracks, even though some did complete their journey to freedom with that method of travel. One of the most unusual stories I heard was about a man that put himself in a box, then had the box shipped north by train, steamboat, ferry, and finally delivery wagon to Mr. James McKim in Pennsylvania, who didn't believe in slavery. Just like Mr. Jones on Old Mill Road, his wife and children had been sold to another plantation owner somewhere in North Carolina. Jim, didn't we hear his name was Henry Brown, and after this people started calling him Henry Box Brown?" Henry asked his brother. "That's right," Uncle Jim answered. Will's father continued, "A lot of the people in our community and other communities in Canada became involved in helping others to freedom. John Freeman had told you about Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor, but what he didn't mention was that his wife, Jane King, went home to North Carolina on more than one occasion to visit her family. Each time she came back to Canada, she always brought other former enslaved people with her. So in answer to your last question, yes, many in our community worked on the Underground Railroad. Fortunately, after the American Civil War, there wasn't a need for this railroad because enslavement of black people was no longer legal. He put his arm around Will's shoulder. Son, I am proud of you. Proud that you are going to work on this different kind of railroad, and proud that you will be representing the members of this community. Just remember to always be an honorable man and to treat others like you would like to be treated. We will all be praying for you. I love you. Tears began to well up in Henry Perry's eyes. The other three men stood up, and one by one they shook Will's hand, then gave him a hug and said, "Go in peace." Bang! 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 Will was jolted out of his thoughts about that day before he had left home by the loud sounds of gunshots. Bang! Bang! To his right, a large flock of birds took flight out of their nesting place among the treetops. The dusty road that Will was traveling was surrounded by dense woods on both sides. He silently slipped into the growth of brushes near the ditch on the side of the road. Crouching down, he began stealthily crawling in the direction the gunshots came from. About 20 yards into the woods, he came to a small clearing where he could hear the voices of two men. Will slowly separated the tall grass he was laying in to get a better view of the men standing in the clearing. "Did you see that shot, Joshua? I hit that old jackrabbit from 50 yards, a big muscular black man said proudly, holding up his prize to show the white man standing in front of him, who was just as big and muscular. "You're one of the best hunters in the county, Aaron. Looks like we got us some good eating today," the man named Joshua said. Will decided this was a good time for him to carefully back out and get out of there. Just as he began to turn, a twig broke under his knee. Both men spun around, turning their guns in that direction. Joshua silently signaled Aaron to move to the left as he circled to the right. In an instant, they crashed through the brush and were on both sides of Will with their guns pointed at his head. "Boy, what you doing here? You could have gotten yourself killed. We thought you were another rabbit for our stew," the hunter named Aaron said. Will lay there shaking, trying to talk, but nothing came out. Finally, stuttering, he said, "Sir, I was just seeing what all the shooting was about. I'm sorry." "You need to be. Dang near caused me to have a heart attack," Joshua said. "What's your name, boy?" Aaron asked. "Will Perry, sir," he said, beginning to relax. "Are you any kin to Henry and Jim Perry?" Aaron asked. "Yes, sir. Henry Perry is my dad, and Keziah is my mother." "Well, I'll be. I came up here to Canada with them boys on the Underground Railroad nigh on 20 years ago," Aaron said, looking at his friend. "My name is Aaron, and this is my friend Joshua. Get yourself on up from there and come and join us for some fresh rabbit stew. Are you hungry?" "Yes, sir," Will said, surprised at the sudden positive turn of events. Will stood up, grabbed his knapsack, and followed the two men further into the woods. Nightfall was coming, and the setting sun cast eerie shadows on the ground from the trees. However, he felt safe with this strange pair, partly because one of them seemed to know his family. About a quarter of a mile into the heavily forested area, they came to another clearing with a log cabin sitting in the middle. There was a neat vegetable garden to the left of the cabin and a small patch of young sweet corn on the right. Chickens were scratching around the yard, and a couple of goats were munching on some grass, and smoke could be seen floating out of the cabin's chimney. When they got closer to the cabin, the door suddenly opened, and out charged the biggest gold-colored dog Will had ever seen. The dog headed straight towards Will, racing past the two men. Before any of them had the chance to say or do anything, the dog jumped on Will with his paws on Will's shoulders. Will was tall for his age, but when the dog was on his hind legs, their faces were directly even with each other. The dog began licking and kissing Will all over his face. Aaron said, "Down, Augie, down, boy." The big dog immediately obeyed his master. "Sorry, Will, Augie isn't used to visitors, so he always gets excited, especially when young people come around, which isn't very often," Aaron said. Joshua laughed. "At least you won't have to wash your face for supper, Will. Augie has already done that." Will and Aaron joined in the laughter as the three continued to the house, with Augie bouncing happily alongside while Will patted him on his head, repeatedly telling Augie what a good boy he was. Inside the log cabin they were greeted by a jovial little lady. Her skin was very dark, and when she smiled, her white teeth lit up her face. "Who do we have here?" she asked. "This is William Perry, son of Henry, and of course nephew of Jim. You know, the brothers that came to Canada the same time as we did," Aaron replied. "Who could forget those boys, two of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet?" "How are your pa and uncle doing?" the lady asked. "They're fine, ma'am," Will answered politely. "I see he has manners like his family, and he also inherited not only their good looks, but is tall like them as well." Will was very proud that his family was so well respected by these strangers he had just met. Looking around the one-room cabin, he could see the neatness of the yard extended to the inside of the house. A big iron pot was hanging over the hearth, and the smell of vegetable soup filled the room. He never realized how hungry he was until his stomach began to growl. "Sounds like we have us a very hungry young man here. You men go wash up while I set the table. We will have the rabbit stew another time. I don't think that belly of William's can wait for me to cook it," Aaron's wife said. The three headed out to the well to draw some water, with Augie right beside Will. It seems like those two had bonded, and Augie was making sure he was close by his new friend's side. Will learned that Aaron's wife's name was Carrie, and they came from Kentucky. They were childless like his Uncle Jim and Aunt Lynetta, so the animals were their children. Besides the goats, chickens, and Augie, they had the most beautiful gray cat named Dusty. Dusty reminded Will of the cat Spencer from the book The Adventures of Spike and Spencer that Mrs. Kerr always read to the grade 1 students on their first day at the Elmstead Pew Settlement School. Joshua and his wife had come to Canada from Ireland in 1845 to escape the starvation and death caused by the Great Potato Famine. They lived not far from Aaron and Carrie, and the two couples had become fast friends. After a delicious dinner, Will and Augie went out into the front yard and played fetch with the ball Miss Carrie had given them. Joshua had gone home after supper, leaving Aaron and his wife sitting on the porch drinking iced tea and watching the two new friends frolicking in the yard. "You say that boy is going to get a job on the railroad? Don't you think he's a little young for such a thing?" Carrie asked. "He's big enough. Besides, this experience will help him learn how to deal with people in life. Why, I remember when I was his age, I could pick 5 acres of cotton a day," Aaron bragged. "You know you ain't picked no 5 acres of cotton a day. You always exaggerating. Besides, this younger generation ain't had to deal with the hardships we did," Carrie said with obvious concern. "You always want to baby children. I say if you want to be a man, get out in the world and toughen up. Shoot, if a child stubbed his toe, you would keep them bedridden for a week," her husband said. They both laughed because they knew what Aaron said was close to being the truth. Next morning, bright and early, Will gathered up his belongings, kissed Miss Carrie goodbye, gave Aaron a firm handshake, and headed back towards the woods. When he almost reached the edge of the farmyard, Augie came running from behind the cabin to say goodbye to his friend. Will knelt down and took the dog's large head in his hands. "Well, fella, I got to get going. I'm following my dreams, but I'll never forget you." Augie nuzzled his nose under Will's arm. Will kissed him on top of his head and turned away. Augie sat and watched as Will began to leave. Will turned back once to look at Augie, and he could swear he saw a tear in the big dog's eye.